While the war in the Middle East escalates, Ukraine is sealing defense agreements with the countries of the region to provide them with anti-drone technology. The US, on the other hand, does not exclude redirecting arms shipments from Ukraine to the Middle East. And to discuss the latest and its implications for Europe, we're joined by James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. So far, three Arab states have reached an agreement with Ukraine to implement Kiev's anti-drone technology, to protect them from Iranian strikes. Now, what impact will it have on the war with Russia, and what can Ukraine get in return for their drones?
Well, it's a little bit unclear what role this will play with the war from Russia against Ukraine, but I would say that this deal does seem to be a positive step in the direction of increasing Ukraine's relations with these Gulf countries who do have a lot to offer for Ukraine. The deal opens up Ukraine's defense industrial sector to potentially have exports to the Gulf states, which would increase funds for Ukraine. Of course, the biggest thing that President Zelensky and the Ukrainians want are the existing missile defense systems that many Gulf state countries in the Middle East has and that Ukraine needs. That's the big prize that Ukraine wants from this deal. But I do think generally this deal that President Zelensky has inked with three Gulf states does reflect the necessity of adoption, innovation, and diversifications that all countries around the world, the Gulf states are just the latest example of, really need to be embracing. Simply just because with the way conflicts are being fought now, whether in Ukraine or in the Middle East, it's just simply not economical or efficient to fire hundreds or thousands even of really expensive missiles at cheap drones that the Iranians are firing. So the obvious answer here is Ukraine, as in my opinion, the most prepared country in the world with the know-how to defend against these drone attacks. So hopefully it's a little bit of give and take for all sides and get the Ukrainians the missile defense they need, while also exporting and providing some much needed revenue as well.
Talking about taking and giving, the US Secretary of State claims that no decision concerning redirecting arms shipments for Ukraine has been made so far. But if such a necessity arises, the US comes first. Now, given the perspectives of the war in Iran, well, little perspective of the war coming to an end soon, should Ukraine expect disruptions in arms deliveries?
Well, it's a little bit too early to say if we should expect disruptions in arms deliveries. That really is the million or perhaps even the billion-dollar question. But I think the potential is there for some disruption. If you just look at the rate of fire and the rate of use of many of the U.S. kit and the systems in the Middle East, it is worrying the burn rate that we're seeing. There's the much commonly cited statistic that in the war in Iran, there are more than 800 pack missiles were used, and that's more in this 1 month period that Ukraine has received since the start of the Russian full-scale invasion in 2022. So obviously that burn rate is a bit concerning. As you noted, Secretary Rubio has said there have been no decisions made yet. But I think it does call into the question the existing Pearl initiative, prioritized systems for Ukraine. It's literally in the name. So I think it's something that we're going to have to keep watching. And I hope at least many policymakers in Ukraine, in Europe, hopefully those in Washington as well, are also thinking through alternatives of what can be done to make sure Ukraine does receive the kit that it needs while the conflict in Iran continues.
Well, Donald Trump has once again stated that the US has no obligation to protect its NATO allies. What is the American president trying to achieve by saying that?
Well, I think you would need to ask the American president directly what President Trump thinks when he means that. Of course, the United States does have an obligation to protect its European allies, and specifically its NATO allies. There is the Article 5 role within NATO that is a mutual defense clause. that up until this moment has really still been ironclad. Even President Trump has reiterated his claim to it. But I think this is just a long another example or episode in which the United States role in Europe and the security of Europe has been eroded or called into question. So I think that the generous assumption is that this is a way to get Europe to spend more on its own defense, and I think on balance that can be a good thing, but it's certainly not ideal to hear that the United States has no role in the European security architecture.
A G7 meeting in France ended yesterday with tensions reportedly flying high, especially between Marco Rubio and EU's top diplomat Kaja Kallas over the very little progress in peace negotiations with Russia. Do you understand her feelings, her disappointment?
Yes, I think we should be candid here that there are some very real feelings of frustration toward the transatlantic relationship. I would say regarding these reports of the tensions between Secretary Rubio and the High Representative Kallas, I wouldn't put the fate of the transatlantic relationship to rest on a singular relationship between two diplomats. But I do think it's fair to say that there generally is some frustrations in the relationship, and whether that's going to boil over, I think remains to be seen. But if you look back even to just this year, continued U.S. tariffs on not just on Europe, but Europe in particular, coupled with the war in Iran, which has really caught many Europeans by surprise, in addition to really kind of an unclear set of demands from Washington about what it expects from Europe, going back and forth, and then President Trump calling NATO a paper tiger. That is all not helping. And I think the frustrations that we have seen in the press do point to a real problem in the transatlantic relationship. One that I hope that we can put behind us and be resolved. But I do think generally it's clear the United States does play a major role in Ukraine, and Europe still needs the United States on side, in particular for its support in Ukraine. And I think that's why we saw a lot of reports of other diplomats emphasizing the role that the United States could play as a productive actor in the G7, in Europe, in Ukraine, et cetera.
Let me quote Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Security guarantees come only after a peace deal is reached. What does it mean for Ukraine?
That is, again, a critical question, and it's not entirely clear. The administration seems to still have security guarantees on the table, but then Secretary Rubio took a step back in some of his comments about kind of being a neutral arbiter and presenting the both sides demands to the Ukrainians, the Russian demands, I should be clear. I do think that the war in Iran has been a little bit of a distraction from U.S. peace talks or U.S. involvement in peace talks, but the U.S. has in its past articulated that it would help secure peace in Ukraine, whatever it's led to. Secretary Rubio said it's ultimately up to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership to decide what happens in those negotiations. Of course, that refers to the major question of territory and who controls which territory. So it's still good. It's still true that the Ukrainians are the ones that get to decide over the fate of Ukraine. But it's important that we see an articulation and a strong articulation of a U.S. role in Ukraine in any sort of peace deal.
So you say that the war in Iran is diverting attention from Ukraine to the Middle East. Well, and it seems that Russians, they know how to seize this opportunity, how to use it. What do you make of the Russian lawmakers' delegation visiting the Congress?
Well, I certainly don't think it's a good idea. Let me just say that. So the Russian trip here, these members of the Duma, of the Russian legislature, meeting with a handful, and I should stress a very small number of members of the extreme, I would say, in the U.S. House of Representatives. I frankly see this more as a publicity stunt than anything else. As everyone knows, that the Duma, the Russian legislature, does not hold power in Russian policy, or frankly, much power at all. And I wouldn't suggest that these members who they met with hold much sway either. The Russian side even said that there was no specific agenda, just to resume communication. But I do think generally it is not a good sign to normalize these sort of relations in connections with the Russians. These Russian MPs are sanctioned by the United States, still remain sanctioned by the United States. They have these specific members who came to the country have been outspoken in their disdain for the United States, including its support for Ukraine, with threats of a nuclear war on the United States. So I would caution the normalization of ties with Russia in any capacity going forward.
James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council, was our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for more interviews and news here on TVP World.